The first shot almost left the range forever, because the bullet climbed high on a bad gust, and the tracer burned past the top of the beam close enough to the red safety flag that the speakers crackled and the air itself seemed to flinch. For one stunned heartbeat, nobody moved, because the visiting two-star general and his staff were watching from the glass tower above, and the extended range demonstration was already behind schedule, so every instructor on the ground knew a second miss that high would trigger an automatic shutdown they could not afford. The novice trainee behind the rifle had just been ordered to send it faster so the general would see something worth his time, which meant all eyes were still on that lane when dust kicked in the forbidden zone and the warning tone from the safety system started its harsh electronic whine. Before the echo faded, a woman in a faded range vest moved inside the concrete blockhouse because she had been watching the wind for 10 minutes and knew the next rush shot would go over the berm. So her hand slammed down on the big red ceasefire button and every firing light on the line flipped from green to red. The valley dropped into a shocked silence, because bolts locked back, muzzles came up, and the amplified voice of range control barked through the speakers demanding to know who had just killed the line at the exact moment the general finally leaned forward to watch. Mara Ellis kept her hand on the button for a breath longer than necessary, because experience had taught her that if she let go too soon, someone louder would seize the story and twist her caution into cowardice, so she held her ground beside the humming console. On the gravel outside, trainees rose from their rifles with a guilty half-turn of kids caught mid-prank, and several pairs of eyes cut toward the small blockhouse window where her silhouette showed against the glowing panels, which meant a target for blame had already begun to form. Staff Sergeant Koenig, the lead instructor, ripped off his ear protection and spun toward the tower, because he wanted the general to see him acting decisive when things went wrong. But Colonel Reeves' sharp gesture stabbed downward toward the control shack, so the anger that should have aimed at the bad wind turned instead toward the clerk who had shut everything down. Koenig stomped through spent brass toward the doorway with his jaw clenched, because it was easier to attack the person who hit the button than admit he had pushed a shaky kid into a shot he could not control. And by the time he reached Mara, his mind had already decided she was the problem. She stayed where she was when he filled the doorway, because stepping back would look like an apology she did not owe. So she stood with her clipboard tight to her chest and the emergency panel glowing red beside her shoulder. The image of the last impact still hung in her thoughts, because she had watched the date bloom in exactly the wrong place while the wind flag snapped hard to the right, and those details matched the numbers she had been quietly scribbling in the margins of a logbook all morning. Up in the tower, Major General Hale shifted his weight, which meant the whole chain of command shifted with him, and Reeves leaned over the range intercom because both his schedule and the sniper course's inspection score were now tangled in this stalled demonstration. "Why is my range cold?" The colonel's voice snapped through the speakers, distorted but sharp enough to slice through the murmurs, so every head on the firing line turned toward the blockhouse and landed on Mara like a row of rifle barrels. Mara picked up the handset because nobody else stood by the console, and she explained that the last shot had clipped the safety margin and the wind had shifted again, which meant continuing rapid fire at that distance broke their own written SOP and risked a real accident. Her explanation dissolved into static when Koenig yanked the handset from her fingers, because he knew that if the colonel accepted her reasoning, then blame would climb up the ladder toward him. So he raised his voice and framed the ceasefire as an overreaction by the clerk before she could finish. He told Reeves she had panicked because the round looked high, which meant she clearly did not understand that long-range shooters sometimes walked shots in, and he promised that the line was safe if they were allowed to continue the demo without further interruptions. In the tower, Hale narrowed his eyes at the distant steel plate that still sat clean and silent on its post, because the briefing packet he had read that morning claimed this course produced consistent hits at extended range, yet he had seen nothing but misses and now a safety stop that looked like chaos. Reeves glanced from the target to his watch and then to the general, so the thin silence between them hardened into pressure, and he jabbed the intercom switch to order the line reset and to demand that somebody hit that far plate before their training window closed. When the speakers clicked off, Koenig turned on Mara because he needed a face for his frustration, and he hissed that she had embarrassed them all, that she would explain herself in writing later, but that right now she would get out of the way and stick to logging scores. Mara nodded once and stepped back from the console, because starting an argument in front of the general would only confirm the story Koenig was already selling, so she pushed her anger down and tightened her grip on the battered clipboard instead. Her restraint made the whispers behind the line grow bolder, because the trainees took their cue from their instructor and let their comments carry just loud enough for her to catch words like spooked and paperwork princess, so the blame that should have gone toward the wind and bad coaching drifted sideways onto her. She forced herself to watch the flags instead of the faces, because numbers were the only power she still held. So she jotted the time of the ceasefire, the angle of the red cloth, and a quick sketch of the boiling mirage above the steel plate in the distance. Those small marks were echoes of other ranges in other countries where her corrections had quietly kept people alive, which meant she knew this pattern of gusts and shimmered air well enough to predict where each bad shot would land. But the regulations taped to the wall behind her insisted her duty today was just to observe and report. Range control crackled over the radio to warn that their slot was almost done, because another company was waiting for the firing lanes, and Rivas repeated that countdown through the speakers as a stiff instruction to complete one final extended range string before he and the general walked away. He hustled along the gravel calling out names, because he needed students who at least looked steady behind a scope, so he pointed them toward the far target and barked corrections about breathing and trigger squeeze that had nothing to do with the physics now chewing their round sideways. The valley had its own plan, because heat rose off the ground in warped sheets and the crosswind pushed all that boiling air against the hill, and every time a trainee fired, the bullet curved into dirt with a splash so far from steel that the spotters' voices grew thinner over the loudspeakers. Mara wrote each impact and the shouted corrections beside it, because the habit of tracking patterns was older than this base and older than this job, so her margins filled with small arrows and numbers that all pointed to the same problem. They were underreading the wind and overtrusting the chart taped to every firing point. From the tower, Hale watched the dirt dance around the target and listened to the empty seconds after each shot when no ring came back, because silence told him more than any briefing could. So the course's proud claims in his folder began to feel less like facts and more like advertising. Some of the trainees, feeling his gaze on their helmets even from that height, started glancing toward the blockhouse between strings, because blaming the woman who had hit the button was easier on their egos than admitting they were in over their heads, so her shadow at the window became a quiet lightning rod for their frustration. One of the younger sergeants, Diaz, finally stepped back from his lane and pulled off a glove to rub at his forehead, because the gusts had scrambled his confidence. So he drifted near the blockhouse while waiting for his next hand and muttered that he could not see the pattern anymore. Mara, still half hidden behind the narrow window, pointed with her pen toward the nearest flag in the line of scattered impact marks on her clipboard, because she could see exactly how far the gusts were shoving the rounds, so she quietly suggested a different hole that matched her notes instead of the printed table. Diaz followed the direction of her pen and then looked toward the line of instructors, because he knew Koenig hated correction from anyone he had not personally anointed. So he swallowed her advice and stepped back to his lane without passing it on, which meant the next shooter repeated the same error and burned another round into harmless dirt. Each wasted bullet scraped more seconds off the clock Rivas was guarding, because range control's voice returned to warn again that their time slot was closing. So the colonel leaned toward Hale and said, a little too quickly, that the course normally performed better and that the wind today was unusual. Hale made no comment, because the monitors showed him the wind had been shifting in a predictable rhythm for the last hour while nobody adjusted. So the pattern of misses told him the real problem on the ground was not weather but pride. When Koenig stalked back past the shack, his boots grinding brass, he shot Mara a look sharp enough to cut paper, because in his mind the entire mess had started with her refusal to trust his judgment. So he needed her to carry the weight of his faltering demonstration. She thought about reminding him that the last round before the ceasefire had kissed the safety margin exactly the way the SOP described, because the rules on the wall backed her thumb on the button. But she knew that saying it now, with his pride in pieces and the general watching, would only paint a clearer target on her back. So she stayed silent and wrote faster, which meant the only record of what the wind was really doing lived in the cramped margins of a logbook and in the sensor data the cameras were quietly collecting for the general's after-action review. That silence was meant to protect her, but it became the first real setback, because no one corrected the bad wind calls and the firing line kept sending rounds where the valley chewed them apart, So the course's reputation slid downhill while the story above remained. The clock panicked and killed our momentum. By the time Reavers jabbed the intercom button once more and announced that there would be one last string to prove the course could hit steel before range control shut them down, everyone understood they were on their final chance, and every eye that drifted toward Mara carried a little more resentment. The final shooter of the day stepped behind the rifle with shoulders already tight, because he had watched every miss before his and knew the general's patience was gone. So the weight of the whole demonstration sat on his trigger finger before he even looked through the scope. Koenig crowded close to the lane and barked instructions to send it as soon as he had a sight picture, because the colonel had warned that the next delay would end the session, so the pressure on the young man rose with every second he took to breathe. Mara, watching from the shack, saw the hesitation in his posture and recognized it, because she had seen that same frozen moment in other lives when fear and expectation knotted together. So she understood that whatever shot came next would not be precise, only desperate. If she did nothing, the bullet would sail off again and the program would fail its inspection in front of the general, which meant her earlier ceasefire would be written forever as a pointless disruption instead of the safety requirement it had been. She thought about the classified orders buried in her personnel file that forbade her from talking about the operations where she had learned to read wind and mirage like a second language, because those restrictions had kept her invisible and safe after a political mess overseas. But now that same invisibility was strangling any chance of stopping the slow-motion wreck unfolding on the range. The shooter's finger trembled on the trigger while the mirage boiled and the wind flag leaned hard, because the valley did not care about nerves or rank, so every fraction of a second he delayed made the shot worse. Mara felt the moment closing like a hatch, because she knew the next sound could be another wild impact in forbidden dust and the end of the course's credibility. So a quiet anger pushed through the caution that had kept her small for years. If she stayed in the blockhouse, she would be safe on paper and ruined in truth, because the record would show that she watched the course fail while holding the information that could have saved it. So she decided that if she was going to take a hit in her file, it would be for doing the right thing, not for disappearing. She stepped out into the sun and walked toward the firing line with slow, deliberate strides, because any hint of hesitation would give her enemies something to use, and the crunch of gravel under her boots drew a fresh wave of muttering from trainees who could not believe the clerk was leaving her little room. Koenig saw her coming and almost signaled range control to remove her, but the tower glass glittered with the general's presence above them, so he hesitated just long enough for her to reach the edge of the concrete and raise her voice. Mara addressed the instructors, not the students, because the rules said her words had to climb through the chain of command to have any hope of sticking. So she requested permission for a single shot to confirm the wind call and salvage the test before the lane went cold. For a heartbeat, the line looked at her as if she had spoken a different language, because the idea that the woman who logged scores and checked her protection could touch a rifle in front of a general did not fit any story they had about the world. So a few trainees snickered and one assistant instructor smirked openly. Koenig turned her request into a joke, because if he mocked her loudly enough, then any failure would make him look generous for having allowed it. So he keyed the intercom and asked the colonel if they really wanted the paperwork girl taking their last shot with a 2-star watching. Reavers heard the time pressure in range control's voice and the warning in Hale's silence beside him, because the window was closing fast, so he decided a public miss from an unqualified shooter might at least give him someone to blame in his report and granted grudging permission for one round. The moment that approval crackled over the speakers, responsibility for the outcome dropped onto Mara's shoulders, so everyone on the line understood that if she missed, the course's failure would be nailed directly to her name. She wrapped her hands around the spare rifle on the bench, because nobody else was moving toward it and range protocol demanded a weapon in experienced hands, so the warmth of the metal under her fingers pulled up old memories of other rifles on other days when silence had been life or death. Her logbook lay open against her hip, so she flipped to the current page and traced the messy lattice of numbers and arrows she had been building since morning, because somewhere in that pattern lay the exact hold the valley demanded, and she refused to walk to the line guessing. The instructors watched her work with a sort of irritated curiosity, because her calm, methodical movements did not match the picture of a panicked clerk they had been laughing about all afternoon, so annoyance flickered in a couple of faces as their own rushed wind calls reflected back at them. Up in the tower, Hale stepped closer to the glass and asked the tech to keep recording angles tight on her lane, because he recognized the practiced little rituals of people who had done hard things under harder conditions, so he wanted every second preserved for whatever board would later dissect this mess. On the ground, the last shooter stepped aside at Koenig's barked order, and Mara slid into position behind the rifle, because nobody had dared openly refuse the colonel's authorization. So the jokes died to a low hum as she settled the stock into the pocket of her shoulder. The familiar weight of the rifle steadied her breathing, because muscle memory from years she was not allowed to talk about took over. So the roar of the range thinned to a narrow tunnel that held only her, the scope, and the quivering speck of steel at the far edge of the valley. Through the glass, the target shimmered like a coin in boiling water. But Mara ignored the illusion and watched instead how the heat waves leaned and the dust devil stepped across the low ground, because those small movements told the truth about the crosswind in a way the chart never could. She checked the flag, checked the mirage, and set her hold far into the wind and slightly above the plate, because her notes showed that every earlier round had been shoved the same direction and undercorrected by the same margin. So she dialed the scope to a solution nobody else here would have believed. Behind her, Koenig snapped that she had 10 seconds because the general did not have patience for theatrics, and his voice carried down the line like a countdown, so the pressure from time squeezed the world around her down to the rhythm of her heartbeat. Mara exhaled slowly, let the cross eyes settle where everything she had seen said it did not belong, and pressed the trigger straight back, because she had already decided that if this ruined her career, she wanted it ruined by a shot she believed in. So the rifle bucked and the valley held its breath. The first round smacked into dirt low and left of the plate, because the gust she had built into her hold sagged just before impact, and the dull puff in the wrong spot told her exactly how much the wind had lied. So she adjusted the correction in her head even before the echo reached her ears. Koenig's relief burst out as a sharp laugh, because for an instant he believed the narrative had snapped back into his hands, and a couple of trainees copied him with nervous chuckles, which meant the social weight on the line started leaning again toward the safe old story that the clerk had no business at the rifle. Mara did not look up, because meeting their eyes would only feed their scorn, so she stayed in the scope and watched the way the dust settled and the heat waves tilted now that the round had passed. In the tower, Reavers opened his mouth to call the lane cold and end the whole ordeal, because the schedule was strangling him and he wanted the embarrassment over. But Hale did not move or speak, which meant the colonel hesitated for one more breath and left a thin slice of time uncancelled. Mara slid her hand to the bolt and worked it with smooth, economical motion, because no one had actually said the string was finished and the original permission had not limited her to a single trigger press if she stayed within the brief window, so she took the chance that still remained. She sent the second round with a tighter hold and a slightly higher aim point, because the flag and mirage showed the gust had come back with more strength, so she trusted the numbers in her logbook more than the uneasy silence behind her. That bullet cut the air just right of the plate, because the wind pushed harder across the valley halfway through its flight, which meant her corrected bracket now had two clean edges instead of one, and the target sat waiting between them like a problem begging for a final solution. The laughter along the line faded to a strained hush, because two misses in opposite directions did not look like random flinching anymore. So even the trainees who had mocked her earlier leaned forward as though their eyes might help her find the path. Koenig's jaw clenched while he watched those near impacts, because he understood how shooters walked rounds into distant steel, and he felt the story slipping away from him. So he began to raise his hand to call the string done before she could finish the pattern. Mara squeezed off the third round before he could speak, because the wind picture had finally stabilized in her mind and she knew exactly where the last two impacts had landed. So she held between them and let the bullet ride the invisible river she had been mapping all day. The steel plate rang like struck bell metal, because the round hit almost dead center and set it swinging on its chains, so the sharp metallic note bounced off the valley walls and rolled back over the line in a way nobody could ignore. For a heartbeat, the entire range froze, because the idea of the paperwork girl behind the rifle could not coexist with the clean, decisive sound they had just heard. So every face on the line had to catch up to the reality that the one person they had laughed at had done what none of them could. The lane spotter snapped out of his shock first and called impact into his MIC with a voice that cracked, because protocol demanded a clear confirmation when steel was hit, so the word echoed from speaker to speaker while dust still drifted from a berm. Range control announced that the time window was over and ordered the bay cold. But the usual scramble to clear rifles did not start, because everyone was still staring at the far plate as it swung gently in the heat shimmer. So the end of the firing period arrived wrapped in a stunned silence instead of routine chatter. Mara eased her head up from the stock and stepped back, because the shot was done and nothing she said could make it louder. So she let the evidence hang in the air, knowing that what came next would have more to do with rank and paperwork than with physics. Koenig lunged to reclaim the narrative before anyone else spoke, because he understood how quickly a single moment could erase 100 shouted orders. So he pointed at the posted range rules and snapped that she had exceeded the spirit of her authority by firing at all. He reminded everyone that only rostered shooters were supposed to fire during the evaluation, which meant that regardless of the hit, she had violated protocol, and that gave him a solid regulation to brandish in front of confused trainees who were suddenly looking at her as if she had grown a second set of stripes. Rivas seized on that point, because it offered a way to right the incident that protected the course's image. So over the tower intercom he acknowledged the impressive shot but described her move onto the line as unauthorized interference that might have compromised the evaluation's integrity. Hale said nothing yet, because he was reviewing the digital feed that had captured every round from the moment the near-safety violation triggered the ceasefire, so he saw the sequence of impacts before and after her intervention and the way the system's logs lined up with the scribbles in her book. Mara remained standing near the bench with the logbook still open in her hand, because she knew anything she said right now would be twisted into defiance or arrogance, so she let the people with rank fill the silence with their own explanations while the steel plate swung behind them like a quiet, undeniable witness. When the line finally went fully cold and weapons were cleared, the instructors gathered into a loose knot outside the blockhouse, because the general had requested a debrief on the spot, so their usual swagger thinned into a mix of anxiety and calculation. The trainees drifted toward the bleachers but chose seats close enough to hear raised voices, because no one wanted to miss the verdict on what they had just seen. So a semicircle of sweat-streaked faces formed around the debrief area without anyone officially calling them to attention. Hale asked for the tablet recording and Mara's logbook to be brought up to the tower, because he preferred numbers to stories when something felt off, so a tech hurried to unplug the feed while a junior lieutenant walked over to Mara and, with visible discomfort, asked for her clipboard. She handed it over without hesitation, because those pages of cramped notes were the only voice she trusted right now. So she watched the logbook travel upward in the lieutenant's hand like a piece of herself being carried into a room where she was not invited. Koenig leaned toward Rivas and pressed again for formal charges over her breach of protocol, because he needed the official record to say that any success she had stumbled into came at the cost of discipline. So by the time the tower door shut above them, the institutional pressure around her was already forming into a familiar shape. Inside the glass room, Hale replayed the whole afternoon from the system's memory, because he wanted to see whether the story he had been told about a jumpy clock matched the data. So he watched shot after shot tumble into date while the wind flags on screen leaned the same way. He asked the tech to overlay impact markers and timestamps, because he believed in what could be measured more than in what could be excused. So the display filled with colored marks clumped in an ugly pattern below and to one side of the steel plate. When the playback reached the near safety violation, he saw the offending round scrape the upper boundary of acceptable trajectory and watched the system light up, which meant the emergency stop had been triggered at the exact moment the rule said it must, not at some random spike of fear. He opened Mara's logbook and compared her messy arrowed notes to the timestamps, because he suspected those margins contained a map of the valley's behavior. So he traced her corrections and watched them line up almost perfectly with the wind shifts and missed impacts on the screen. By the time the video showed her 3-shot sequence walking onto steel, with each hold change matching the gust data the system recorded, Hale no longer saw a lucky clock but a trained marksman who had read the environment more clearly than anyone else on that range. He called Rivas to his side and pointed wordlessly at the overlay, because the colored markers and scribbled notes said more than any speech could. So the colonel had to watch, frame by frame, as the story of the afternoon rearranged itself around the one person he had hoped to blame. The colonel's face tightened, because if the general chose to frame Mara as the only one who had actually understood the wind, then his handpicked instructors would be exposed as having ignored the clearest data in the valley. so the scapegoat he had been building in his head began to look less solid. Hale asked, in a tone too neutral to be friendly, why someone with this level of fieldcraft was assigned as a range clerk instead of as a senior instructor, because the file summary he had skimmed that morning had not hinted at this depth of skill. So Rivers mumbled something about prior issues and best fit without meeting his eyes. The general did not push further then, because he knew better than to dig into redacted history on an open network, so he simply closed the logbook and told the colonel there would be a formal review of both the course and the way talent was being handled on this base. When they left the tower and walked back to the waiting knot of trainees and instructors, the heat and dust could not blunt the sense that something larger than a bad day on the range was now in motion. Hale stopped a few paces from Mara and the others and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear, because he understood that this moment would set the story people told long after he flew out, so he chose his words with the understated bluntness that carried weight in uniform. He noted that sensor logs showed a pattern of unsafe rounds before the ceasefire and confirmed that the emergency stop had been hit exactly when the rules required, which meant any narrative about panic was incompatible with the data the system had captured. He then stated, just as plainly, that the final 3-round sequence which had produced the only hit on steel at extended range was deliberate, not lucky, because the holds and win calls matched both the instrumentation and the shooter's own notes, so the demonstration's one success belonged squarely to the woman who had been logging scores. Koenig's shoulders seemed to shrink a fraction as the trainees looked from the general to Mara, because the authority they respected most had just stamped her judgment as credible in public, so the jokes they had traded earlier died in their throats and left a heavier quiet behind. Hale finished by announcing that while stepping onto the line outside her formal role had been a breach of procedure and would be reviewed as such, the larger concern was how someone capable of that performance had been left in a position where her voice could be so easily dismissed, so the institution itself now stood in the center of the scrutiny she had carried alone. After the general's convoy rolled away, everyday noise slowly seeped back into the range, because there were brass buckets to empty and targets to reset, so people did what they always did after a storm and tried to act like nothing lasting had shifted. The trainees approached Mara in small, uncertain clusters, because they were caught between the mockery they had joined earlier and the respect the general's words demanded now, so some offered awkward thanks for saving the demo, while others simply met her eyes and nodded without speaking. She powered down the consoles and signed the last lines on the range log, because paperwork did not care about pride or rumors, so her neat handwriting marched across the same form she had filled out 100 times on quieter days. Koenig passed the blockhouse without stopping, because everything he wanted to say about insubordination and embarrassment now had to fight its way past the image of her hit and the general's endorsement, so his anger condensed into a clipped reminder that she could expect a meeting with the colonel about today's choices. Morris simply said, "Yes, Sergeant," because arguing in the hallway would only feed his need to regain face, so she kept her voice flat and let him walk away with whatever pieces of authority he could still salvage. In the days that followed, the base did what bases always did with a story that touched rank and reputation, because it turned the range incident into rumor long before any official memo landed, so Mara found herself watched more than spoken to. In Chow Line, she heard versions of her own afternoon retold by people who had not been there, because tales of a range clerk out shooting the cadre traveled fast, so she caught fragments about impossible shots and secret special operations pasts murmured over plastic trays. Some co-workers treated her like an urban legend come to life and offered small, embarrassed compliments in the hallway, because they liked the idea that someone invisible could suddenly be revealed as dangerous in a good way, so they smiled and then hurried on before anyone important saw them chatting with her. Others kept their distance, because they understood that being too close to the center of any controversy could stain their own records when the paperwork finally shook out, so briefings and meetings grew cooler around her even as low-level admiration quietly spread. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, the institution moved at its own slow, grinding pace, because Hale's command-level questions had triggered an investigation not into heroism but into risk, so her name appeared at the top of agendas for people who mostly knew her as a personnel number. Rivers wrote his official report with more care than honesty, because he wanted to satisfy the general's demand for data without hanging his own cadre out to dry, So he framed Mara as a highly capable clerk whose impulsive decision to fire had complicated an already challenging demonstration. He emphasized the importance of respecting roles and procedures, which meant his recommendation leaned toward a formal reprimand and mandatory counseling on following the chain of command, and in that version of events her hit was a footnote under the larger issue of disobedience. That document, if left standing alone, would have marked her record with a stain that future promotion boards might never bother to read past, because the shorthand of good shot, bad judgment was easy to file and hard to unlearn. At the same time, Hale received the full copy of the range recording and scanned images of her logbook in his office miles away, because he had insisted on seeing what the valley itself had witnessed, so he pored over the alignment between wind shifts, impact points, and her written corrections in slow, methodical silence. The more he studied those pages, the more he recognized a level of fieldcraft rarely found outside units whose existence lived mostly in blacked-out briefings, so he started to suspect that the real institutional risk on display was not her breach of protocol but the system's tendency to hide its best tools when they cut the wrong way. He pulled her restricted personnel file through secure channels, because the vague hints about a previous incident in her basic record bothered him. So he read through heavily redacted evaluations that still carried enough detail to sketch the outline of the shooter she used to be. The comments that survived the censors spoke of calm under fire and unnervingly precise wind calls in urban and desert environments, which meant her judgment had once been trusted when people's lives depended on single trigger pulls, not on inspection scores. Buried deeper, he found mention of a political firefight over collateral damage on a mission whose specifics had been blacked out, because someone higher up had needed a narrative that traveled well in briefing rooms. So Mara's objections to a shot and her insistence on calling off an engagement had made her a convenient name to move sideways instead of up. Reading that, Hale saw the same spine that had driven her thumb into the ceasefire button on the range, because in both cases she had chosen safety and integrity over speed and face, so he understood why she had ended up in a job designed to keep her skills out of sight. He drafted a classified memo of his own that described her performance on the range as exceptional judgment and marksmanship under complex social and environmental pressure, which meant his signature would sit in the same file as the colonel's reprimand and refuse to let the easy story win without a fight. When the review board finally sat down in a small windowless room to discuss the Ellis incident, Mara found herself at a plain table under fluorescent light. Because institutional judgment always looked more ordinary than the moments that triggered it, so she folded her hands and answered their questions without ornament. She walked them through the afternoon step by step, because they needed the sequence clear for their own protection as much as for Hayes, so she described when she first noticed the wind shift, why the near-safety violation had scared her more than the muttering behind her, and how the SOP used the same line she had seen that round scrape past. They asked where she had learned to read Mirage with that kind of precision, and she replied that portions of her service were compartmentalized and she was not cleared to speak about them, because respecting those walls had cost her enough already. So the board members glanced at the secure file that Hale's memo had pierced. They pressed on why she had left her station and taken the rifle after being told to log only. So she told them quietly that the combination of expiring time, failing performance, and deteriorating safety picture had left her with a choice between watching a preventable disaster play out or stepping in and accepting personal consequences, because she believed doing nothing would have been the bigger breach of duty. She acknowledged, without excuse, that stepping onto the line had violated the written roster rule, so the board had something solid to hang their eventual decision on besides rumor and discomfort. Her refusal to badmouth Koenig or Reavers, even when they were not in the room, surprised some of the officers on the board, because they were used to seeing frustration spill into accusations during these interviews, so her focus on facts instead of feelings made the earlier label of panicked clerk ring hollow. At the same time, her admission that she had known she was bending the rules gave the board the opening it needed to assert the primacy of procedure, because institutions almost never passed on the chance to remind people where the lines lay. In the end, they split the difference in the way only bureaucracies could, because they wrote a minor written admonishment for firing outside her assigned role into her record while also adopting Hale's recommendation that her skills be considered for advanced marksmanship training duties, so the same incident that scarred her file also quietly unlocked a path it had not held before. When a personnel officer briefed her on the outcome, the language was dry as dust because it reduced everything to phrases like procedural deviation and noted aptitude. So she simply nodded at the mention of the reprimand and blinked when she heard she was being transferred to an elite training detachment on another base. She walked out of the office with a single sheet of paper in her hand, because her punishment and her promotion had arrived stapled together. So the residue of the range incident settled in her life as both a bruise and a door. On her last afternoon at the familiar range, the air smelled of the same gun oil and sun-baked dust it always had, because other classes were still running drills on shorter lanes, so nothing in the concrete walls announced that anything different had ever happened here. Mara boxed up her few personal items and slid her logbook into the top of her bag, because she intended to carry this one with her instead of leaving it in a drawer where the patterns inside might be forgotten. So the worn cover disappeared under a folded range vest. Trainees and junior NCOs wondered by on thin excuses to have forms signed or keys returned, because word of a transfer had circulated and some of them did not want to let the moment pass without saying something. So she received soft thanks and shy comments about how they would never again treat wind flags as decoration. Koenig walked through once, eyes fixed straight ahead, because whatever he felt about the final outcome lived in a space between his original report and the general's memo that he could not navigate without risk. So he settled for a Kate nod that cost him nothing and protected his pride. Diaz stopped in the doorway and admitted, in a low voice, that he wished he had passed her suggested wind correction up the line that day, because maybe things would have broken earlier and easier. So she told him that next time he saw a pattern nobody else saw, he should trust it enough to speak even if his voice shook. She left the range without a ceremony, because transfers from mid-grade specialists rarely came with fanfare, so the building shrank behind her in the side mirror of the shuttle just like any other concrete box on base. What followed over the next few years did not make recruiting posters, because most of the work she moved into at the new detachment lived in the shadowy gap between public marksmanship courses and classified support to units that did not give public interviews, so her contributions were counted in improved hit rates and fewer safety incidents rather than in medals. Her students learned early that she did not care where they came from or how loudly they talked when she was not around, because on the firing line the only thing that mattered was whether they respected what wind and distance were telling them. So they watched the flags and mirage with a seriousness that surprised their previous instructors. Every now and then, a rumor about the clerk who outshot the cadre would surface among new arrivals, because the story had grown roots in different battalions, so she would hear her own past in distorted fragments and let it pass without confirming or denying anything. On clear afternoons when a novice shooter stared at a distant plate and whispered that the shot looked impossible, she would answer that physics did not care about rank or gossip, only about truth and discipline. So somewhere beyond that range another piece of steel would ring and another small circle of witnesses would fall suddenly quiet, remembering that once, laughter on a hot valley floor had turned into respect because one woman finally showed what she could do. The board that met weeks later looked painfully ordinary, because it sat in a windowless room with humming vents and plastic folders, so Mara simply folded her hands and explained that she had left the console because time, safety, and performance were collapsing together in front of a watching general. The officers split the difference in the way institutions always do, issuing a brief written admonishment for stepping outside her role and, tucked deeper in her file beside redacted pages, a sealed note from Hale praising her judgment and marksmanship under pressure. So the same afternoon she signed for both a reprimand and a transfer to an advanced marksmanship detachment 2 states away. At the new range, her name still never appeared on posters, because her students took the credit when their rounds found steel on days the wind lied. So when a novice shooter once turned in surprise after an impossible hit, Mara only adjusted her cap and called the next lane ready, knowing that respect, for people like her, usually arrived wrapped around consequences that never quite washed off.